morning, everyone. I'm Joe Amster, Vice President of Membership here on our parish board. Welcome, First Parish, Unitarian Universalist, Canton. We are a welcoming and caring, diverse faith community that seeks to nurture and inspire each person's spiritual journey while serving others in our commitment to peace and justice. Thank you. All right, today we have Reverend Richard Trudeau with us. He's actually been here before because I remember seeing him here, and that was a wonderful time. Reverend Trudeau was for 17 years the minister of the UU Church in Weymouth, and for 35 years a teacher of math and history of astronomy at Stonehill College in Easton. His latest book is Bible Stories for Skeptics. That actually sounds pretty interesting. He is married to Susan O'Connor, who works at a nonprofit that teaches computer skills to residents of Roxbury.
Good morning. The opening words are by the poet and playwright Archibald MacLeish. Why, it was wonderful. Why, all at once there were leaves. Leaves at the end of a dry stick, small, alive. Leaves out of wood. It was wonderful. You can't imagine. By the wood path, the earth loosens. The earth relaxed. There were flowers out of the earth. Think of it. And oak trees oozing new green at the tips of them, and flowers squeezed out of clay, soft flowers, limp stalks flowering. Well, it was like a dream. It happened so quickly. All of a sudden, it happened. Could we join, please, in the opening hymn, number 86, Blessed Spirit of My Life. introduction to the prayer, I want to read you a little bit from chapter 1 of Genesis, the first chapter of the Bible. That's the creation in 6 days. This is part of the sixth day. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." Not a very ecologically friendly message. Males and females are created together in the image of God and are given the earth and its resources to do with as we wish. Biblical scholars, going back 150 years, have figured out that chapter 1 of Genesis is not the original beginning of the Bible. It was written hundreds of years after chapter 2 of Genesis, which was written by someone else hundreds of years earlier. The original beginning of the Bible had a completely different ecological message, but of course we miss it because what a crazy idea that chapter 2 would be written by a different person than chapter 1. It never occurs to us. So the voice in chapter 1 drowns out the voice in chapter 2. But listen now to the voice in chapter 2. Excuse me. In the day that the God Yahweh made the earth and the heavens, the God Yahweh formed a human from the dust of the ground and breathed into its nostrils the breath of life, and the human became a living being. And the God Yahweh planted a garden in Eden in the east, and the God Yahweh took the human and put it in the garden to till it and keep it. So here, we're not in the image of God, we're made out of dirt. Males and females are not created simultaneously. A human of indeterminate gender is created, a single human who later will be split into a male and a female. And our purpose in life is to till the garden and keep it. And the Hebrew word that's translated keep there has a connotation of guard or protect. So our purpose in life is to till the soil and care for it. It's a completely different message, ecologically speaking. Kurt Vonnegut, the novelist and also a UU, composed a prayer based on the second passage I've read, based on the story in Genesis 2, the original beginning of the Bible. And I'd like you to join me in this prayer. Every line is said twice, so I ask you to repeat after me. God made mud. God got lonesome. So God said to some of the mud, "Sit up. See all I've made. The hills, the sea, the sky, the stars." And I was some of the mud that got to sit up and look around. Lucky me, lucky mud. I, mud, got to see what a nice job God had done. Nice going, God. Nobody but you could have done it, God. I certainly couldn't have. I feel very unimportant compared to you. In fact, the only time I feel the least bit important It's when I think of all the mud that didn't even get to sit up and look around. I got so much, and most mud got so little. Thank you for the honor. Soon mud lies down again and goes to sleep. What memories for mud to have? What interesting other kinds of sitting up mud I met. Almost everything I saw, I loved. Amen. And now for the support of this congregation and its work, the morning offering will be gratefully received and I hope freely given. The person who wrote the ecologically friendly creation story, the one now in chapter 2 of Genesis, also wrote the story of Cain and Abel in chapter 4. I'm going to read it. I'd like you to pretend you've never heard it before. I'd like you to forget everything you've ever been told about it, about what it means, what the moral is supposed to be. Try to hear it afresh and try to notice the details. Now, Abel was a keeper of sheep and Cain a tiller of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to Yahweh an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel, for his part, brought of the firstlings of his flock, their fat portions. And Yahweh had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering, Yahweh had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. Yahweh said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let us go out in the field." And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then Yahweh said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" Cain said, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And Yahweh said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hands. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." Cain said to Yahweh, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Today you have driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." Do you know this puzzle? In the middle of a big field, there's a man lying face down, spread-eagled, a pack on his back, dead. And the puzzle is to explain. I encountered this at a dinner party. We retired to the living room after dinner, and this was proposed, and we were supposed to come up with explanations, and we voted on the best explanation. And someone suggested the man was a hiker, which would explain the pack on his back. And while crossing a big field, he had a heart attack and fell dead. That didn't win because it didn't account for the details. Around here, hikers usually are not crossing fields. They're usually in the woods or climbing hills. And if someone fell down of a heart attack, how likely is it that the person would wind up face down, spread-eagled? That didn't win. Other suggestions were made. And then after a while, during a lull, a woman who had not spoken said softly, "His parachute didn't open." And that won. He was a skydiver. That's why the field, right? People do skydiving over fields. That was why his position, that's the position in which skydivers dive. The pack was his parachute, which hadn't opened. And of course, he was dead because of the fall. Everything was explained. That won. The story of Cain and Abel has long seemed to me a puzzle. What was wrong with Cain's offering? Was there anything particularly appropriate about Cain's punishment? Why has this story been passed on for centuries? What is it preaching against? What is Cain's sin? Is the story preaching against just murder in general? Or is it fratricide in particular? Or is it jealousy? Or what? I wanted an understanding of the story that accounted for the details. Well, in the last few decades, archaeologists have learned things about the original Israelite people, things that make it possible now to come up with an interpretation of the story that I think accounts for the details. Suddenly we have the context of the story. The context of the story was never included with the story because it was something that everyone knew at the time. And what everyone knows, no one mentions. So the story has come to us out of context. But here's the context, I think. The Israelite people first appear in the archaeological record in the 12th century BC as the founders of new settlements, tiny villages on hilltops in central Palestine. And by Palestine, I mean that geographical area. Their pottery is exactly the same as that of the Canaanites who were then living down in the fertile valleys and on the coastal plain. And so archaeologists have concluded that the first Israelites were Canaanites. They were Canaanites who had moved up into the hills to get away from the Canaanite kings and their armies who were controlling the fertile valleys and the coastal plain. The first Israelites were Canaanite hillbillies, if you like, where I use that term without a derogatory implication. The hillbillies in Appalachia live in those remote areas because they want independence from the government, from authorities. They want freedom. And this is what the first Israelites seem to have done. They were Canaanites who moved up into the hills, establishing new settlements where no settlements had ever been before, in order to be free. But they paid a big price for this. It was really tough to make a living up in the hills. There was a problem with the soil, there was a problem with the climate, and there was a problem with labor. The problem with the soil is there was only a thin layer, making farming difficult. The problem with the climate was the Israelite hill country gets about as much rain in a year as London gets, but London gets it in 320 days. And these hill settlements got it in 50 days. They got it all at once in a rainy season in February and March. So it would rain quite a lot for 50 days, washing the soil down the hillsides. And then the sun would come out and the land would bake for the next 10 months. To try to eke out a living as farmers up there, these first Israelites built cisterns that they plastered on the inside to make them waterproof, to store rainwater, water storage tanks. And they built stone walls across the hillsides. And above the stone wall, they would put dirt, making a kind of shelf, a terrace. And then a few yards further downhill, there'd be another terrace, and so on. So the hillsides were transformed into what looked like staircases. And these terraces would prevent the soil from being washed downhill. And when one terrace was irrigated, the water soaking out would irrigate the next terrace downhill. But this required a tremendous investment of labor. This was labor intensive. This was hard labor to make those cisterns and to maintain them, to make those terraces and maintain them. And there was a labor shortage in these little villages because they were tiny. A typical village might have 8 extended families, and so a total population of maybe 90 people, of whom a couple of dozen or slightly more were capable of the hard physical labor required to maintain the cisterns and the terraces. These people were living right on the edge of ecological disaster. To make their situation a little less precarious, they divided their economy in half. They put all their eggs in 2 baskets. They spent about half their effort growing crops, wheat and barley and grapes and dates and figs mostly. And they devoted the other half of their efforts to animal husbandry. They raised sheep and goats mostly, sheep for wool and a little meat. They didn't eat much meat. And goats for milk and yogurt and cheese. This way, if some year the rains came at the wrong time and the crops failed, the community could survive on animal products for a year. Or in another year, if there was a problem with the animals, the community could become vegetarians for a year. And they developed an ethic of hard work and cooperation. We find this there's an old law code in the book of Exodus, older even than the Ten Commandments. And one of the laws in this old law code, this is Exodus 23:12, chapter 23, verse 12. God is portrayed as saying this: 6 days you shall do your work, and on the seventh day you shall rest. And we hear that today, and we hear the second part mostly, the injunction to take a day off. But the first part is important too. 6 days you shall do your work. Working 6 days from sunup to sundown, trying to scratch out a living on a farm in the Israelite hill country, was harder than most people in the Middle East had to work to make a living. They were paying a price for their freedom, but it was worth it to them. This is the context of the story of Cain and Abel. Let me look at it again, thinking of this context. It begins, now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground. So these brothers were involved each in one of the halves of the economy of one of these tiny villages up in the hills. Abel was tending sheep, and Cain was planting crops. In the course of time, Cain brought to Yahweh, their God Yahweh is sort of like a 4-H judge here. Cain brought to Yahweh an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel, for his part, brought of the firstlings of his flock, their fat portions. Abel is bringing meat. Cain is bringing produce. And Yahweh had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering, Yahweh had no regard. Well, what's wrong with Cain's offering? A little later, Yahweh says to Cain, if you do well, will you not be accepted? So apparently Cain didn't do well. That is, the crop wasn't very good. There's been no indication that Cain was a lazy or incompetent farmer, so I think it was just a roll of the agricultural dice. Maybe there was a blight that year. Maybe the rains came at the wrong time. Even in the rainy season, you see, sometimes the rains would start and farmers would get their crops in, and then the rains would shut off for 2 or 3 weeks, and the seedlings would die before the rains resumed. Something like that may have happened. Just a roll of the agricultural dice. And next year, the situation could be reversed. Next year, there might be a problem with the animals, and then it would be the product of Cain's labor that would preserve the community. But Cain doesn't take this philosophical attitude. He seems only concerned with his own wasted effort and lack of recognition. The story says, Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. Yahweh said to Cain, why are you angry, and why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. But Cain doesn't master it. He kills his brother, presumably out of jealousy. Now think about what Cain has just done in the context that we've only learned about from archaeologists in the last few decades. In this tiny community living on the edge of ecological disaster, where the wholehearted effort of every person is crucial to the survival of the community, Cain has just removed 2 young men from the labor force. Cain has removed his brother, of course, because he killed him, but Cain has removed himself because no community can tolerate a murderer. Cain has put his community in danger. Cain has put his community in danger. That's the sin of Cain. That's why the story was passed on. Cain's punishment. Yahweh says to Cain, "Now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hands. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." This was written by the person who wrote Genesis 2, in which humans are made out of dirt, and our purpose in life is to till the soil and care for it. Well, Cain has just been estranged from his own nature, from the soil, from his purpose in life to till the soil, because Yahweh says nothing is going to grow for you from now on. He's estranged from his God, who's the principle of the soil's fertility. It's Yahweh that makes the soil fertile. And he's estranged from his community. And Cain says, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Today you've driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." Yes, it's a terrible punishment and completely appropriate. This story comes to us from the remote past. This story was set down on, I was going to say paper, papyrus or something like that, 3,000 years ago. And it comes to us without a context. And so it's for a long time it's been a passage whose meaning that people have had to guess at. But I think now that we know the context of the story, this package coming to us from the remote past is a present. It's a gift. It's a powerful story with a message of environmental responsibility. Cain's sin, I said, was to endanger his community. Well, more specifically, he was self-centered in an ecologically fragile environment. He was self-centered in an ecologically fragile environment. And the application today is obvious, right? In the last several decades, we've learned that the entire earth is an ecologically fragile environment and is vulnerable to the self-absorption of a small number of people. The whole earth is in a situation just like one of these tiny Israelite hilltop villages in the 12th century BC. The whole earth is in that situation. I'm glad that biblical scholars have discovered that the voice in Genesis 2 is a different voice from Genesis 1. That enables us to see that people who use the Bible to support exploiting the earth and its resources are just focusing on one voice. There's another voice. There's another voice there telling us in this old story that environmental self-centeredness is a sin. An old story that encourages us to pull together, as the people in these hilltop villages did, remembering our dependence on the earth and its plants and animals, and especially each other, remembering our dependence on each other. Could we join in our closing hymn, number 1064, in the teal hymnal, Blue Boat Home?
Standing on these mountains and plains,
May ours be a religion that, like sunshine, goes everywhere. Its temple, all space. Its shrine, the good heart. Its creed, all truth. Its ritual, works of love. Amen.